India didn't send a single soldier to this war. It didn't fire a missile, station a warship in the Gulf, or issue a single public threat toward Tehran. And right now, it may still be the country paying the highest price for a conflict it never chose to enter. Somewhere along a quiet stretch of coastline on the Gulf of Oman, there is a control tower that no longer exists. It went down in a matter of seconds. Hit by American aircraft as part of a much larger operation most of the world is still describing purely as an Iran story. But maritime analysts noticed something within hours that almost no mainstream coverage picked up. And the government in New Delhi has been choosing its words about it with unusual, almost surgical care ever since. I'm Adrian Hale, and I follow what's actually happening across the Iran-Hormuz corridor for you. Not the headlines everyone else is repeating, but the parts of the story sitting just underneath them. Here is what we can actually confirm. The strike on the Chabahar port facility has been corroborated by CENTCOM's own operational briefing, verified independently through maritime tracking data compiled by Kpler and LSEG, and cross-referenced against wire reporting that places American aircraft over Iran's southeastern coast in the same window the tower went dark. Separately, India's Ministry of External Affairs has issued a statement, not denying the strike occurred, but insisting that India's own leased terminals inside the port sustained no damage. 3 sources, 3 different vantage points, one event, and a much bigger story sitting quietly behind it. None of what follows is speculation about intentions we can't verify. It's a pattern built entirely out of publicly trackable strikes, publicly available shipping data, and the public statements, and silences, but of the governments involved. Follow the pattern with us. To understand why a control tower on the edge of the Gulf of Oman matters more than almost anything else that happened this week, you have to understand what this operation actually was. And it did not start as an attack on trade infrastructure. It started as a response. For days, Iran had been restricting maritime traffic through the Strait of Hormuz and issuing direct threats against American vessels operating in the Gulf. Washington's answer was not a narrow, symbolic strike. It was a wide, sustained air campaign aimed at paralyzing Iran's entire southern coastline, and the target list was broader than most people expected. To understand why Chabahar specifically would end up at the center of this, it helps to go back further than this week. The port's role in regional trade isn't new. India, Iran, and Afghanistan signed a trilateral agreement establishing Chabahar as a joint transit corridor roughly a decade ago. And India has continued funding terminal upgrades and equipment there in the years since, even as its broader relationship with Tehran has moved through multiple rounds of sanctions, negotiations, and diplomatic friction. Through all of that, Chabahar survived as one of the rare pieces of India-Iran cooperation that both governments treated as too economically valuable to disrupt. That history is precisely what makes this week's strike so unusual. It didn't just damage a piece of infrastructure. It damaged something that had functioned reliably through years of much smaller crises. On July 14th, American aircraft began hitting infrastructure connected to Bandar Abbas, Iran's largest port, and the single most important artery for its southern trade. This wasn't limited to military installations. Highways and rail bridges linking the port to Iran's interior, and ultimately to Tehran itself, were struck and disabled, with the heaviest damage concentrated around Bandar Kpler in Hormozgan province. According to CENTCOM's own characterization of the campaign, the intent went beyond degrading the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps' military assets. It extended into Iran's civilian and commercial logistics networks, the roads, bridges, and transit corridors that move ordinary goods, not just weapons. Bandar Abbas alone handles a large share of Iran's total container traffic, and it sits directly across the water from the narrowest, most heavily trafficked point of the Strait of Hormuz. Disabling the roads and rail lines feeding it doesn't just slow Iranian trade. It creates a bottleneck for anything trying to move fuel or cargo overland toward the capital, at exactly the moment Iran's maritime options were also being constrained. Global energy traders took notice almost immediately. Crude benchmarks moved on the news within the same trading session, less because of any single strike and more because of what the combination signaled. A campaign aimed squarely at Iran's capacity to keep functioning as a trading nation, not just as a military one. Within 24 hours, the effects of the Bandar Abbas strikes were already visible beyond Iran's borders. Cargo backlogs began forming at ports across the wider Gulf as shipping companies rerouted vehicles carrying goods that would normally have moved by road toward Tehran. Regional fuel prices ticked upward. None of this was accidental collateral spillover. It was, according to CENTCOM's own operational framing, precisely the kind of pressure the campaign was designed to generate. Cut the roads, cut the rail, and an entire coastal economy starts seizing up within days, not weeks. 2 days later, on July 16th, the campaign's focus shifted southeast, toward the Sistan and Baluchistan region, where American strikes disabled Iranshahr Airport, cutting off another node in Iran's already strained internal transport network. Iranshahr wasn't a major hub by international standards. But for the province's already sparse infrastructure, it represented one of the only reliable ways to move emergency supplies and personnel into a region that borders both Pakistan and Afghanistan. By this point, a pattern had become impossible to ignore. This was not simply a war against Iranian military capability. It was a war against Iranian mobility itself, the physical ability to move fuel, cargo, and people from one part of the country to another. Then, in the early hours of July 18th, came the strike that would end up mattering far beyond Iran's borders. American aircraft hit the maritime traffic control tower at Chabahar port on the Gulf of Oman coast, and the tower collapsed. On paper, this looks like one more entry in a long list of infrastructure strikes. In practice, it is the most strategically significant strike of the entire campaign, and here's why. Chabahar isn't just an Iranian port. It's the physical anchor of a trade relationship that took India more than a decade and billions of dollars to build. For years, India has used Chabahar as its primary alternative route into landlocked Afghanistan and the markets of Central Asia, a route that deliberately bypasses Pakistani territory, where India has no trade access at all. New Delhi didn't just use this port, it invested directly in it, developing terminal capacity, signing long-term operating agreements, and treating Chabahar as a cornerstone of its regional trade strategy for the entire northern half of South Asia. That strategy has a name most casual observers have never heard: the International North-South Transport Corridor, a multi-country shipping, rail, and road network stretching from Mumbai through Chabahar, across Iran, and up into Russia and Central Asia. India spent more than a decade positioning Chabahar as the corridor's southern anchor, the one piece of the entire network that let Indian goods reach Afghanistan and Central Asia without ever touching Pakistani soil, a country India has had no meaningful trade relationship with in years because of the two nations' long-standing territorial disputes. Every other alternative route India has considered runs either through Pakistan or through corridors dominated by Chinese infrastructure investment. Chabahar was supposed to be the one option that belonged, functionally, to India alone. And while the strikes on Bandar Abbas were framed almost entirely as an Iran story, a war between Washington and Tehran, playing out on Iranian soil with Iranian consequences, the Chabahar strike does not fit the frame nearly as cleanly. The moment that control tower came down, a third country, one with no formal role in this conflict at all, absorbed a direct hit to infrastructure it had spent years in enormous capital building. This was not incidental. CENTCOM's own strategic framing of the broader campaign makes clear that civilian and commercial logistics were treated as legitimate targets alongside military ones, not because India was the intended message, but because economic paralysis was always part of the plan. And Chabahar happened to sit exactly where Iranian trade infrastructure and Indian trade infrastructure occupied the same physical space. But here's the part almost nobody's reporting yet. It isn't just that the tower came down. It's what New Delhi has, and hasn't, said about it since. India's official response arrived quickly, and it was carefully constructed. The Ministry of External Affairs confirmed that India's own leased terminals at Chabahar sustained no damage. That statement is, as far as available reporting indicates, accurate. What it does not address, and what no Indian official statement has directly addressed since, is the control tower itself. Not India's terminal, not India's cargo. The tower that coordinates maritime traffic for the entire port, the single piece of infrastructure that determines whether any ship, Indian-operated or otherwise, can safely enter or leave Chabahar at all. A working port terminal with no functioning control tower is not a working port. It is a stretch of coastline with expensive equipment sitting idle. That distinction is where the real story lives. India's public position is technically true and functionally incomplete, an emphasis on what wasn't hit, and near total silence about the piece of shared infrastructure that actually was. Diplomats in New Delhi have strong incentive to frame this quietly. India has spent years positioning Chabahar as proof that it can build independent trade routes into Central Asia without depending on Pakistani or Chinese-controlled corridors, acknowledging that a single American strike can neutralize the port's usability in seconds, regardless of whose terminal gets hit, undercuts the entire premise of that strategy. There's also a deeper diplomatic tightrope at play here, one that goes back much further than this week's strikes. India has spent decades cultivating what it calls strategic autonomy, a foreign policy tradition of refusing to align fully with any single global power, maintaining working relationships with Washington, Moscow, and Tehran simultaneously, often on issues where those three capitals sharply disagree with one another. Chabahar itself exists because of that doctrine. India built it specifically, so it would never have to choose between its own trade interests and whatever political relationship it happened to have with Iran or with the United States in a given year. This week's strike is arguably the first real test of whether that doctrine can survive contact with a shooting war. A loud, public complaint about the tower's destruction risks straining India's relationship with Washington. Total silence risks signaling to every other country using Chabahar-linked trade routes that India's guarantees aren't worth much when American aircraft are involved. So far, New Delhi has chosen a third option, say just enough to reassure its own public and nothing at all about the part of the story that would force a real diplomatic reckoning. So what happens next, from India's side, is now a genuinely open question. Analysts following the region point to three realistic paths. The first is quiet diplomatic pressure on Washington through back channels, asking for either compensation or a guarantee that Indian-linked infrastructure at Chabahar won't be targeted again, a request that puts the United States in the uncomfortable position of having to distinguish between Iranian and Indian ownership of the same physical port. The second is accelerated hedging toward alternative routes, including, awkwardly, increased informal reliance on Gwadar, despite years of avoiding exactly that outcome. The third, and the one Indian officials have shown the least appetite for so far, is public criticism of the strike itself, a move that would be diplomatically clean but would cost India significant goodwill with Washington at a moment when the two countries' broader strategic relationship has never been closer. Nothing said publicly by New Delhi so far rules out any of these three paths, which is itself a signal that a decision hasn't been made yet. This is where the shipping and maritime intelligence data becomes essential, because it tells a story India's official statements don't. Tracking data compiled by Kpler and LSEG shows vessel movement patterns around Chabahar shifting within hours of the strike, reroutes, delays, and in at least several documented cases, ships altering course toward alternative ports entirely. Insurance markets covering Gulf of Oman shipping routes responded almost immediately, with risk premiums for vessels transiting the area climbing in the same window. Freight forwarders who normally route Afghanistan-bound cargo through Chabahar reportedly began quoting alternative pricing through Gwadar, and even through longer, costlier routes avoiding the Gulf entirely. None of that required an Indian government statement. The market simply reacted to what the control tower's destruction actually meant on the water. A much faster, much more honest signal than any press release. Meanwhile, the broader picture around Hormuz was becoming its own story. With CENTCOM re-establishing what amounts to a naval blockade around Iranian ports, the Strait of Hormuz effectively turned into a minefield for international shipping. Not literally, but functionally, in terms of risk. American Marines boarded the commercial vessel MT Wenyao in the Gulf of Oman after it attempted to breach the blockade, seizing control of the ship and redirecting its course. Days earlier, an empty oil tanker attempting a similar breach was struck and disabled by American aircraft. A clear signal, according to maritime security analysts monitoring the corridor, that the blockade was not symbolic and would be enforced against any vessel, empty or loaded, civilian flagged or otherwise. For a strait that carries roughly a fifth of the world's seaborne oil on an ordinary day, that kind of enforcement doesn't stay a regional story for long. It becomes a global pricing story within hours, as energy markets price and the risk of every tanker that has to decide whether transiting Hormuz is still worth it. Iran, for its part, was not standing still through any of this. In a move that regional analysts describe as at least partly designed to project strength toward rival factions and distract from the economic damage being inflicted on its southern coast, Iranian forces struck camps belonging to Kamala, an Iranian Kurdish opposition group operating in Iraq's Kurdistan region. Between 8 and 9 people were reported killed. Masroor Barzani, prime minister of the Kurdistan regional government, publicly condemned what he called unjust attacks, a story this channel covered in detail in a previous episode, and one worth revisiting if you want the fuller picture of how this conflict has been spilling across Iran's borders in more than one direction at once. At the same time, Iran's own military posture kept expanding. Iranian air defense systems reportedly intercepted additional incoming threats during the same window, and 2 American radar installations in Oman have now moved within range of Iranian retaliatory capability, a detail that maritime and defense analysts are watching closely because it suggests this conflict's geography is no longer confined neatly to Iranian territory or Iranian waters. It is beginning to touch the infrastructure of countries that, like India, never chose to be part of it. Oman, like India, has no formal role in this war, and yet its own radar installations are now sitting inside the range of a retaliatory strike neither Muscat nor New Delhi asked to be exposed to. Now here's where this stops being a story about one strike, one port, or even one country, and starts being a story about how wars get fought in 2026. Taken individually, these strikes might look like a fairly conventional military campaign. Degrade the adversary's ports, cut its transport links, pressure its economy until it changes behavior. That's a strategy with a long history. But put every piece next to each other, Bandar Abbas's bridges, Iran Shah's airport, Chabahar's control tower, the blockade, the boarded tanker, and what emerges is something more deliberate. A campaign built around treating economic and logistics infrastructure as a primary target, not a side effect of military operations. That distinction matters because of what it does to countries that aren't even parties to the conflict. The report data behind this story frames it as the militarization of geopolitical economics, a shift from wars fought over territory and military assets toward wars fought over water systems, power grids, bridges, and, in this case, the ports that connect entire regions to global trade. And when critical logistics infrastructure sits at the intersection of two or more countries' trade strategies, as Chabahar does for both Iran and India, a strike aimed at one country's economy can absorb another country's investment as an unintended casualty, without a single shot being fired at that second country directly. This is exactly why alternative trade corridors, projects like the Multinational Development Road Initiative connecting Asian markets to Europe by land and sea, are increasingly being treated not as economic convenience, but as national security infrastructure. Countries watching what just happened to Chabahar are drawing an uncomfortable conclusion. Any single trade route that depends on a foreign government's territory, airspace, or goodwill can be neutralized in an afternoon, regardless of how much capital was spent building it. India isn't the only country watching closely. China has its own competing investment in the region through Gwadar Port in Pakistan, positioned less than 80 kilometers from Chabahar, as a rival gateway into the same landlocked markets India has spent years trying to reach independently. For years, the standard framing of these two ports has been Chabahar versus Gwadar, India's answer to a Chinese-backed corridor it can't participate in because of its relationship with Pakistan. That framing assumed both ports would keep functioning normally, competing on cost, capacity, and reliability. This week broke that assumption. A weakened, less reliable Chabahar doesn't just cost India money. It potentially reshapes the entire regional balance of which trade corridor countries in Central Asia and Afghanistan choose to depend on going forward. And every kilometer of cargo that shifts toward Gwadar strengthens exactly the alternative India spent a decade trying to avoid depending on. There's a broader economic ripple here too, one that has nothing to do with India, Iran, or Pakistan specifically. Every time critical shipping infrastructure gets treated as a legitimate military target, global insurers and freight operators quietly adjust their long-term risk models, not just for this conflict, but for how they price shipping through any contested region going forward. Analysts tracking global trade patterns have pointed to this campaign as part of a broader trend, the slow, uneven militarization of the infrastructure that keeps global supply chains functioning, from ports and pipelines to power grids and water systems in conflicts elsewhere in the world. When that infrastructure becomes fair game, the resulting price increases don't stay contained to the country being targeted. They move through freight costs, insurance premiums, and ultimately consumer prices in countries that have never appeared in a single headline about this war. That is a geopolitical consequence far larger than a single damage control tower would suggest on its own. And it's not only South Asian trade routes taking notes. Gulf states with major foreign finance port developments, African nations hosting Chinese-built logistics hubs, and even European countries with energy infrastructure sitting inside contested waters are all effectively watching the same case study play out in real time. The lesson being absorbed well beyond this region is a simple one. Foreign investment in strategic infrastructure no longer comes with an implicit guarantee of protection just because the investing country isn't a party to whatever conflict eventually reaches that infrastructure's doorstep. That is a quiet structural shift in how nations will likely approach overseas infrastructure investment for years to come. And it started this week with a control tower most people outside shipping circles had never heard of until it was gone. Which brings us back to where we started. India never sent a soldier into this conflict. It never fired a missile, never threatened Tehran, never asked to be involved in a war between Washington and Iran. And yet, a single strike on a piece of shared infrastructure on the Iranian coastline has left New Delhi managing the fallout anyway, quietly reassuring its public about terminals that weren't hit, while staying almost entirely silent about the tower that was. That is what it looks like when a conflict stops respecting the line between combatants and bystanders. Not a declaration of war against a third country, nothing that dramatic, nothing that clean. Just a control tower that used to coordinate a decade of Indian investment, reduced to wreckage in a war India never asked to be part of. It's worth sitting with how quiet this kind of consequence tends to be compared to everything else this campaign has produced. A boarded tanker makes for a dramatic image. A blockade makes headlines. A collapsed control tower on the edge of someone else's war barely registers outside specialist shipping circles, right up until the moment ships start rerouting, insurance premiums start climbing, and a government thousands of kilometers away has to decide how much of the truth it's comfortable telling its own public. That is precisely why this story matters more than its size on the news cycle suggests. The biggest consequences of modern conflict increasingly aren't the ones that make the loudest sound. They're the ones that show up 2 weeks later in a shipping manifest, a rerouted cargo ship, or a diplomatic statement written to say as little as possible. So here's the question this leaves us with. Was the Chabahar strike simply unavoidable collateral damage in a much larger campaign against Iran? Or was hitting shared infrastructure always going to be part of the strategy, precisely because of the pressure it puts on countries like India? Let me know which one you think it is. And wherever you're watching this from, drop it in the comments. I want to know how this story is landing depending on where in the world you're seeing it unfold. Are you seeing this covered where you live, or is this the first you're hearing of it? I read every single comment on this channel, and if enough of you are asking the right follow-up questions, that's exactly where the next video in this series is headed. This story isn't over. The moment there's new movement at Chabahar, a fuller response out of New Delhi, or the next piece of this campaign along Iran's coastline, we'll be back with it, because a war that's already reached a country that never joined it usually isn't finished reaching the rest of them either.